The Celeste Blanco snapped taut against the South Atlantic wind at 9:15 a.m. April 2nd, 1982, as Lieutenant General Leopoldo Galtieri's greatest gamble began with the metallic click of a flagpole latch echoing across Stanley's government house. This is the story of how Argentina's military junta staked everything on 74 days of brutal warfare 8,000 miles from home, and why understanding their perspective reveals not just tactical courage under impossible odds, but the fatal miscalculations that doomed young conscripts to fight in frozen trenches they never should have occupied. The taste of diesel exhaust still lingered in the mouths of the 601 commandos as they regrouped outside Government House, their black face paint streaked with sweat despite the autumn chill. Captain Pedro Giacchino lay dead in the hallway behind them, killed in the brief firefight that claimed 2 Argentine lives and 1 Royal Marine. The first blood spilled in what Buenos Aires confidently expected to be a short, victorious crisis. Governor Rex Hunt had surrendered after token resistance, his colonial authority crumbling as easily as the junta's strategists had predicted. The Buzos Tácticos, Argentina's elite naval commandos, secured the harbour, while Marine infantry consolidated positions throughout Stanley. By noon, Operation Rosario had succeeded beyond Galtieri's most optimistic projections. In the Casa Rosada, champagne corks popped as intelligence reports confirmed minimal British military presence. The Falklands garrison consisted of fewer than 80 Royal Marines, backed by a single patrol vessel. No reinforcements could possibly arrive for weeks, if at all. The island's 1,300 kelpers, as locals called themselves, would simply have to adapt to Argentine sovereignty, just as their ancestors had done when Britain seized the Malvinas in 1833. Galtieri's calculations seemed flawless on paper. Britain's new Prime Minister, Margaret Thatcher, faced economic recession and declining naval power. The Royal Navy had scrapped its last conventional aircraft carrier, HMS Ark Royal, the previous year. The remaining carriers, Hermes and Invincible, were small, helicopter-focused vessels that Argentine planners dismissed as vulnerable to long-range air attack from the mainland, 600 to 700 kilometers away. The timing appeared perfect. Spring was ending in the South Atlantic. Winter storms would make any British task force's journey treacherous by May. Argentina's air force possessed modern fighters, Mirage 3 interceptors, Dagger ground attack aircraft, and the prized Super Etendards armed with Exocet missiles. The Navy's Task Group 79 centered around the carrier 25 de Mayo, supported by the cruiser General Belgrano and Type 42 destroyers, equipped with Sea Dart missiles. Brigadier General Mario Benjamin Menendez arrived on April 3rd as military governor, his staff officers already drafting defensive plans for the 10,000 to 13,000 troops who would garrison both East and West Falkland. Logistics appeared manageable. C-130. Hercules transports could reach Stanley's 1,250-meter runway from the mainland, operating under blackout procedures to avoid detection. The conscripts began arriving within days. Born in 1962 and 63, these Colimbas, as Argentina's draftees were known, formed the backbone of the island garrison. Most had served only 3 to 6 months, trained for continental warfare in temperate climates. They carried summer-weight jackets and canvas boots suited for parade grounds, not peat bogs that would freeze solid by May. But morale remained high in those first weeks. The soldiers shared their rations guiso de lentejas, yerba mate, and sandwiches made with breaded cutlets with curious locals who taught them camp English phrases and peat-cutting techniques. Radio Colonia broadcast inflated victory reports from Buenos Aires, where Plaza de Mayo crowds chanted support for the military's boldest gamble since independence. Nobody mentioned that Argentina possessed exactly 5 AIM-39 Exocet missiles at war's onset. Nobody calculated the fuel consumption required to maintain air superiority over the islands. Nobody anticipated that British naval gunfire would reduce peat trenches to flying clods of frozen earth, or that conscripts would sleep in waterlogged foxholes with their boots frozen solid at dawn, their toenails turning black after 10 to 14 days of trench foot. The priests held mass in windy tent chapels, distributing rosaries before the first patrols. Mechanics painted shark mouths on Skyhawk noses in hangars that still smelled of fresh metal and hydraulic fluid. Picture yourself among those young faces in Stanley's muddy streets, that April breathing the metallic tang of South Atlantic air, believing your nation's honor depended on holding 8,000 square kilometers of peat, bog, and sheep pasture against the fading British Empire. If you're following this story from anywhere in the world right now, hit that like button and subscribe for more untold military history. Your engagement helps small channels like this one compete with the big networks. 3 weeks later, nuclear-powered submarines would begin stalking Argentine warships through the cold waters of the exclusion zone, and those same conscripts would learn that summer jackets offered no protection against sleet-whipped winds at 40 to 60 kilometers per hour. 323 Argentine sailors vanished beneath the grey swells of the South Atlantic on May 2nd, as HMS Conqueror's torpedoes tore through the cruiser General Belgrano's hull, transforming Galtieri's confident naval strategy into a desperate struggle for survival in waters that would claim over half of Argentina's war dead in a single afternoon. Understanding this naval catastrophe reveals how modern warfare's brutal mathematics, submarine technology versus surface ships, logistics versus valor doomed Argentina's conventional forces before the real fighting even began, trapping thousands of young conscripts on islands they could no longer effectively supply or evacuate. The morning had started with routine optimism aboard Task Group 79's flagship. Captain Hector Bonzo reviewed his orders, while the General Belgrano's engines thrummed steadily through the pre-dawn darkness, her escorting destroyers maintaining formation in the moderate seas south of the exclusion zone. The ancient cruiser, built in 1938 as USS Phoenix and survivor of Pearl Harbor, carried 690 crew members who trusted her thick armor and 15 6-inch guns to intimidate any British surface vessels. Admiral Jorge Anaya's naval strategy depended on controlling the sea approaches to the Falklands through coordinated surface action. The carrier 25 de Mayo would launch her Skyhawk squadrons against British ships, while Belgrano's group operated as the southern pincer, catching enemy forces between two concentrations of firepower. Argentine submarine San Luis prowled the northern waters, ready to torpedo any British carrier that ventured within range. But nuclear-powered attack submarines had already begun rewriting the rules of South Atlantic warfare. HMS Conqueror, commanded by Christopher Refford Brown, tracked Belgrano's sonar signature from beyond detection range, her torpedoes armed and firing solutions calculated with computerized precision that Argentina's 1940s technology couldn't match or counter. At 14:57 local time, 2 Mark 8 torpedoes struck Belgrano's port side with explosions that lifted her bow clear of the water. The cruiser's magazine detonated seconds later, vaporizing her forward turret and flooding the engine rooms with superheated steam that killed dozens of sailors instantly. Emergency lighting failed throughout the ship as she began listing heavily to port, her damage control systems overwhelmed by massive structural failure. Captain Bonzo ordered abandon ship 18 minutes after impact. Men leaped into 4°C water wearing life jackets that provided minimal insulation against hypothermia. Life rafts designed for tropical operations proved inadequate for South Atlantic conditions. Thin rubber floors offered no protection from the freezing seas that seeped through every seam and valve. The destroyers Piedra Buena and Hipólito Bouchard rescued 772 survivors over the following hours, their crews working through the night to haul hypothermic sailors from rafts that had become floating coffins for those too weak to maintain body heat. Many survivors watched shipmates disappear beneath the swells, their voices growing fainter until only wind and wave splash remained audible across the oil-slicked debris field. Admiral Anaya received confirmation of Belgrano's sinking at his Puerto Belgrano headquarters, while reviewing plans for coordinated carrier strikes against the British task force. The loss represented more than tactical defeat. Over half of Argentina's eventual war casualties had died in a single engagement, and the psychological impact on fleet morale proved devastating. Surface operations effectively ceased as remaining warships withdrew to port, abandoning the sea lanes to British nuclear submarines that could strike anywhere, anytime with impunity. The 25 de Mayo's air group found itself restricted to sporadic strike sorties from Rio Grande, operating at maximum range with minimal fuel reserves for combat maneuvering. Superétendard pilots knew they possessed exactly 5 AIM-39 Exocet missiles, each one precious beyond measure, in a campaign where resupply from France had become impossible due to the European Economic Community's arms embargo. 2 days after Belgrano's destruction, Lieutenant Commander Augusto Bedacaratz achieved what Argentine strategists desperately needed proof that British ships could be hurt. His superétendard, call sign Cueca, approached HMS Sheffield at wave-top height, the sea spray obscuring his aircraft's silhouette until the final moments before launch. The AIM-39 Exocet missile streaked toward Sheffield's starboard side, its radar seeker acquiring the destroyer's signature despite defensive chaff and electronic countermeasures. 20 British sailors died when the missile penetrated Sheffield's aluminum superstructure, the warhead's explosion igniting fires that spread through ventilation systems filled with toxic smoke. The destroyer's crew fought the blaze for hours before abandoning ship, leaving her to burn and eventually sink while under tow, a smouldering testament to the Exocet's devastating effectiveness against modern warships. Buenos Aires celebrated Sheffield's destruction as vindication of Argentina's aerial warfare capabilities, but the pilots who achieved this victory understood the grim mathematics of their situation. They possessed 4 remaining Exocets for a campaign that might last months. Fuel shortages forced attack windows under 2 minutes over the British fleet, with return flights navigated by coastline recognition and pilot intuition when instruments failed under combat stress. Lieutenant Velasco's Skyhawk limped home from one early strike with instruments blank, his canopy cracked by anti-aircraft shrapnel, navigating by gut feeling, and the Patagonian shoreline's distinctive profile visible through the dusk. His aircraft bore holes in both wings, missing flaps, and punctured fuel tanks sealed with maintenance tape that might fail at any altitude. The environmental reality was beginning to assert itself with brutal clarity. Conscripts stuffed newspapers and plastic bags under their summer-weight uniforms as temperatures dropped toward freezing, the constant sleet-whipped winds at 40 to 60 kilometers per hour, cutting through fabric designed for parade grounds. Rations grew irregular as C-130 flights shifted from landing operations to high-altitude airdrops, the pilots skimming at 15 to 20 meters over surf with cargo doors open, pushing pallets by hand while tracer fire stitched their tail sections. Consider the mathematical impossibility facing those young pilots, flying obsolete aircraft against modern air defenses, burning irreplaceable fuel, expending ammunition they couldn't replace, all to support an invasion force whose supply lines grew more tenuous with each passing day. But in Stanley's waterlogged trenches, conscripts were discovering that the real enemy wasn't British firepower, it was the South Atlantic winter that would freeze their rifle mechanisms solid and turn their foxholes into icy graves. Lieutenant Velasco pulled 4 Gs, climbing away from the burning destroyer, his Skyhawk's wings punched full of holes by 20mm cannon fire, while below him the waters of San Carlos Sound, which Argentine pilots had already christened Bomb Alley, erupted in fountains of tracer and exploding steel as the British task force fought for its life on May 21st. This morning's desperate air assault reveals the savage mathematics of modern naval warfare, how brave men in obsolete aircraft can inflict devastating damage through sheer audacity, and why technical failures, something as mundane as bomb fuse settings, can transform tactical victory into strategic catastrophe. The British landings at San Carlos had begun before dawn, Admiral Sandy Woodward's amphibious force threading through Falklands Sound under cover of darkness. HMS Ardent, Antrim, and the other escorts took defensive positions while landing craft disgorged thousands of Royal Marines and paras onto the beaches. By 0600 hours, the beachhead was secure, but Argentine radar operators at Stanley had detected the massive fleet concentration 70 kilometers to the west. The Westinghouse AN TPS-43 radar installation painted a picture that sent shockwaves through Argentine command. Over 40 ships, clustered in the narrow waters between the 2 main islands, trapped by geography and vulnerable to coordinated air attack. For pilots who had trained their entire careers for anti-ship strikes, San Carlos Sound presented the target of a lifetime if they could survive the approach. Grupo Cinco and Grupo Seis launched from Rio Gallegos before dawn, their A4 Skyhawks and Israeli-built daggers loaded with 1,000-pound bombs and barely enough fuel for the 800-kilometer round trip. The flight profiles demanded perfection. Approach at wave-top height 5 to 15 meters above the sea to avoid British radar, then pull into steep attack runs while defensive fire turned the sky into a lattice of explosions and tracer. Captain Pablo Carballo led the first wave, his formation skimming the South Atlantic swells so low that salt spray cracked his canopy. The Sea Harriers from HMS Hermes and Invincible prowled the high altitudes, their AIM-9L all-aspect missiles outclassing Argentina's aging Mirage 2Is in every parameter except pilot determination. Argentine orders were explicit: avoid dogfights, focus on the ships, get in fast, and get out alive. The attack window over the British fleet lasted under 2 minutes per aircraft. Pilots jinked through curtains of Sea Dart missiles and 40mm Bofors fire, their bomb sights obscured by muzzle flashes and smoke from burning vessels. HMS Ardent took multiple hits, her superstructure gutted by explosions that killed 22 sailors and left her listing heavily to port. HMS Antrim shuddered under a direct impact that penetrated her engine room, but failed to detonate the first hint of the technical disaster that would haunt Argentine air operations. The bomb fusing problem emerged during post-strike analysis at mainland bases. Maintenance crews had set delayed fuses too long, calculating penetration times based on armoured warship hulls rather than the thin aluminium superstructures of modern frigates and destroyers. Bombs punched clean through British ships and exited the other side before detonating harmlessly in the water, robbing Argentina of victories that should have crippled the task force. Lieutenant Commander Alberto Philippi's Skyhawk buried a 1,000-pound bomb deep in HMS Antrim's hull, where it lodged against vital machinery without exploding. British damage control teams spent hours defusing the weapon while their ship limped towards safer waters, her crew knowing that a properly functioning fuse would have sent them to the bottom of San Carlos Sound. The technical failure infuriated pilots who had risked everything to deliver their weapons on target. Flight Lieutenant Cesar Roman returned to Rio Gallegos with his aircraft shot to pieces, fuel gauges reading empty, only to learn that his perfect bomb hit on a British frigate had produced no meaningful damage. Maintenance crews worked through the night to adjust fuse settings, but precious time and ammunition had been wasted on strikes that should have achieved decisive results. Meanwhile, ground conditions in the Falklands deteriorated as autumn deepened toward winter. Conscripts discovered that their entrenching tools bent when driven into frozen peat, forcing them to reinforce Sanga's improvised stone shelters with turf blocks and corrugated metal scavenged from abandoned buildings. Fuel rationing limited each section to 1 or 2 jerrycans per day, forcing cooks to melt sleet in cut-oil drums to stretch their water supplies. The mail from mainland Argentina arrived sporadically aboard C-130 flights that now operated under constant threat of interception. Soldiers slept with letters pressed against their chests for warmth and morale, rereading family news by red-lensed torches in waterlogged foxholes, where breath steamed continuously and rifle mechanisms jammed with peat grit until cleaned with diesel-soaked rags and toothbrushes. Private Ramon Carrasco wrote in his diary about sleeping in a position where water rose to his ankles every night, his boots frozen solid at dawn and toenails turning black from constant moisture exposure. The summer-weight jackets issued to some units provided no insulation against winds that whipped sleet horizontally across the treeless landscape at 40 to 60 kilometers per hour. Radio Colonia continued broadcasting inflated victory claims that soldiers suspected were false, but they huddled around AM receivers at 2100 hours anyway, desperate for contact with a homeland that felt increasingly distant and unreal. The cultural exchanges with Kelpers provided small comfort. Soldiers traded cigarettes for tea and learned Camp English phrases, while locals taught peat-cutting techniques that might mean the difference between survival and hypothermia. BAM Condor at Goose Green launched its IA-58 Pucaras for close air support missions, the rugged twin turboprops flying low-level routes through valleys where British Stinger missiles and Sea Harrier patrols waited. The Pucaras were tough and reliable, but their slow speed made them vulnerable to modern air defences that could engage targets well beyond visual range. Medical supplies ran short as field dressings were reused after boiling, elastic bandages logged by number, and morphine syrets rationed according to triage protocols that prioritized combat effectiveness over comfort. Hypothermia cases increased nightly as temperatures dropped below freezing and wet clothing lost all insulating properties. Imagine yourself in that cockpit at 50 feet above freezing seas, pulling Gs under anti-aircraft fire, while knowing your bombs might not explode even if you survive long enough to deliver them perfectly on target. The technical problems would be solved within days, but by then, British forces were consolidating their beachhead and preparing to break out across East Falkland toward the ring of hills that guarded Stanley, where conscripts were learning that courage alone couldn't stop naval gunfire from turning their trenches into flying clods of frozen earth. The muzzle flash illuminated Lieutenant Colonel Italo Piaggi's weathered face for a split second before darkness returned to the Darwin Peninsula, where his task force Mercedes 1100 Argentine soldiers waited in trenches that smelled of peat smoke and diesel, while British 105mm light guns began their nightly drumroll barrage from 8 to 10 kilometers away. This forgotten battle at Goose Green reveals how Argentina's most competent field commanders fought desperately innovative defensive actions with obsolete equipment, and why the mathematical reality of modern artillery, Thousands of rounds per night versus 10 to 20 Argentine countershots per mission made heroic resistance ultimately futile against an enemy that could afford to waste. Ammunition. Task Force Mercedes represented everything Argentina's military could do right in impossible circumstances. Piaggi had molded disparate units, elements of the 25th Infantry Regiment, Marine Infantry, and artillery support, into a cohesive defensive force that controlled the narrow isthmus connecting Darwin and Goose Green settlements. His positions blocked British advances towards Stanley while protecting the airstrip where Pucarás launched close support missions against enemy concentrations. The terrain favoured defence. Gorse-covered ridgelines provided natural firing positions, while the settlement buildings offered cover for command posts and supply dumps. Argentine engineers had reinforced key strongpoints with interlocking fields of fire, their obsolete but reliable FAL rifles, equipped with optic mounts for precision shooting. Ammunition was rationed carefully. Each rifleman carried exactly 60 rounds, every shot precious in a campaign where resupply depended on C-130 flights that grew more dangerous nightly. British 2nd Battalion Parachute Regiment approached through the pre-dawn darkness of May 28th, their advanced scouts probing Argentine positions with the methodical precision that characterized professional infantry operations. Lieutenant Colonel Herbert Jones led from the front, his battalion committed to eliminating the Darwin Goose Green garrison as a preliminary to the main advance on Stanley. The sound began before sunrise, a distant rumble that Argentine sentries mistook for aircraft engines until the first shells impacted in precise 25-meter intervals. Private Eduardo Santana swore he watched the rounds walk across frozen turf in exact geometric progression, each explosion closer than the last, until a dud slammed into his trench parapet and failed to detonate a malfunction that saved his life and haunted his dreams for decades afterward. British artillery doctrine emphasized overwhelming firepower over precision shooting. The 105mm light guns could maintain sustained rates of fire that consumed thousands of rounds per engagement, their forward observers adjusting impact points with radio-transmitted corrections that brought devastating accuracy to bear within minutes. Argentine positions disappeared under curtains of high-explosive fragmentation that pulverized peat, collapsed sangars, and buried defenders under flying clods of frozen earth. Captain Roberto Estevez commanded the Argentine counter-battery response from positions near Moody Brook and Sapper Hill, his 155mm Sophomore batteries capable of matching British range and explosive power. But ammunition shortages forced selective engagement, 10 to 20 rounds per fire mission versus the hundreds that British guns expended on routine harassment tasks. Every Argentine shell had to count, every target had to justify the expenditure of irreplaceable ordnance. The mathematical disparity became apparent during the first hours of combat. British guns fired continuously, while Argentine batteries remained silent for long periods, conserving ammunition for critical defensive fires. When Estevez did shoot, his crews worked with desperate efficiency, loading and firing as rapidly as their worn equipment allowed before displacing to avoid counter-battery strikes that arrived within minutes. The civilian population of Goose Green, 114 men, women, and children, found themselves trapped between opposing forces as the battle intensified. Argentine officers confined them to the community hall for their own protection, a decision that would generate controversy, but reflected genuine concern for non-combatant safety. Sergeant Major Enrique Lopez rationed food carefully and personally checked on a newborn delivered during the siege, his logbook recording every diaper and bottle distributed despite his unit's own supply shortages. Lieutenant Colonel Jones died leading a charge against Argentine machine gun positions, his death shocking too, Para's assault momentum and forcing British tactics to shift toward methodical reduction of defensive strongpoints. The loss of their commanding officer demonstrated that Argentine resistance remained formidable despite material disadvantages, their defensive fires directed by officers who understood how to extract maximum effectiveness from limited resources. Task Force Mercedes held for 29 hours against overwhelming odds. Piaggi's men fought from trenches, where water rose to ankle depth every night, their rifles jammed with peat grit that required constant cleaning with diesel-soaked rags. Breath steamed continuously in the freezing air, while defensive positions came under naval gunfire from British frigates, whose 4.5-inch shells chewed peat into flying fragments that popped eardrums and collapsed. Bunkers. The supply situation deteriorated hourly, as C-130 flights shifted from landing operations to high-altitude airdrops. On June 1st, a Hercules was shot down near Pebble Island, killing 7 crew members and eliminating another precious transport aircraft from Argentina's dwindling airlift capacity. Surviving flights pushed the operational envelope beyond rational limits. Pilots skimmed at 15 to 20 meters above surf with cargo doors open, crew members pushing pallets by hand while British tracer fire stitched their tail sections. Argentine Marine commandos conducted reconnaissance missions using Gemini inflatable boats, their patrols swimming in 4 to 6 degrees Celsius water for 20 minutes at a time to avoid British detection. The physical endurance required for these operations pushed human limits while providing intelligence that helped coordinate defensive fires and predict enemy movements. Medical facilities strained under combat casualties and environmental injuries. Field dressings ran short, forcing medics to reuse elastic bandages after boiling, while morphine syrettes were logged by serial number and reserved for the most severe trauma cases. Hypothermia triage increased nightly as temperatures dropped below freezing and wet uniforms lost all insulating properties. Air defense around key positions relied increasingly on improvisation as spare parts dwindled. Technicians fused 250-kilogram bombs with contact fuses assembled on site, while mechanics cannibalized damaged aircraft to keep 2 or 3 operational per sortie block. The mobile Skyguard fire control systems for 35mm Oerlikon guns provided some protection, but ammunition consumption rates exceeded supply capacity by significant margins. Picture yourself in those waterlogged trenches, counting shell bursts, while your rifle mechanism freezes. Solid and British naval gunfire walks steadily closer to your position, with mathematical precision that no amount of courage can deflect. On May 29th, after 47 Argentines and 18 British soldiers had died in the settlement's defence, Piaggi ordered withdrawal towards Stanley as his ammunition ran critically low, and British reinforcements threatened to envelope his remaining positions, a tactical retreat that preserved his surviving men for the final battle that everyone knew was coming. Brigadier General Mario Benjamin Menendez traced his finger across the map of East Falkland, marking defensive positions on the ring of hills that surrounded Stanley Mount Longdon, Tumbledown, Harriet, where 9,000 Argentine soldiers would make their final stand against an enemy whose Scorpion and Scimitar tanks already probed the outer perimeters with the distinctive clatter of 76mm, rounds ricocheting off rock in the pre-dawn darkness. This defensive strategy reveals both the tactical intelligence of Argentina's senior commanders and the impossible mathematics they faced. How to stop 3 British brigades with conscripts, whose rifles jammed nightly from peat grit, supplied by airdrops that dwindled to nothing, while naval gunfire turned their carefully prepared positions into lunar landscapes of overlapping craters. Menendez's plan represented orthodox military science applied under extraordinary constraints. The outer screen of hills, Longdon, Two Sisters, Harriet would channel British advances into killing zones where Argentine defenders could exploit superior knowledge of terrain and fields of fire. Depth positions on Wireless Ridge and Sapper Hill provided fallback lines if the outer perimeter cracked, while Stanley itself offered urban fighting opportunities that might bleed British assault forces white before they could secure the airfield. The defensive preparations had consumed weeks of back-breaking labour in conditions that tested human endurance beyond reasonable limits. Conscripts reinforced sangars with turf blocks and corrugated metal, scavenged from abandoned settlements, their entrenching tools bending against peat that froze solid each night. Company C of the 7th Infantry Regiment dug positions with implements designed for continental soil, not the waterlogged bogs that characterized Falkland topography. Argentine snipers equipped with FAL rifles and improvised optic mounts established harassment positions throughout the defensive belt, their mission to slow British movement and force enemy units to deploy prematurely under indirect fire. Sergeant Miguel Carranza recorded 17 confirmed kills from a hide on Mount Longdon's northern slope, his logbook detailing range estimates and ammunition expenditure with the precision of a professional marksman operating at the edge of his equipment's capabilities. But the environmental conditions degraded combat effectiveness hourly. Night temperatures dipped below freezing while breath steamed continuously in dugouts where soldiers slept in waterlogged positions, their boots frozen solid at dawn, rifle mechanisms jammed with peat grit that required constant cleaning with diesel-soaked rags and toothbrushes, while fogged scopes and freezing fingers reduced sniper accuracy during the critical 0200 to 0400 hours when British patrols probed Argentine lines. The supply crisis reached catastrophic proportions by early June. C-130 Hercules flights shifted entirely to high-altitude airdrops after a transport was shot down on June 1st near Pebble Island, killing 7 crew members and eliminating another precious aircraft from Argentina's dwindling airlift capacity. Surviving pilots pushed operational limits beyond sanity. One reportedly skimmed his Hercules at 15 to 20 meters over surf, with cargo doors open, crew members pushing supply pallets by hand, while British tracer fire stitched the tail section. Fuel rationing limited frontline units to 1 or 2 jerrycans per section per day, forcing cooks to melt sleet in cut oil drums to stretch water supplies that tasted of rust and diesel contamination. Rations deteriorated from the guiso de lentejas and yerba mate of April to cold, half-cooked meals eaten under tarps while sleet whipped horizontally across treeless landscapes at 40 to 60 kilometers per hour. The air war reached its crescendo on June 8th when A4 Skyhawks from Grupo Cinco struck the Royal Fleet auxiliaries Sir Galahad and Sir Tristram at Fitzroy and Bluff Cove, killing 48 men and wounding 115 in attacks that Argentine pilots could observe from 30 kilometers away. Smoke columns rose for hours while rescue helicopters worked frantically to evacuate casualties from burning ships whose aluminum superstructures melted under aviation fuel fires. Captain Pablo Carballo's formation had approached at wave-top height through San Carlos water, their attack profiles perfected through weeks of combat experience that transformed peacetime training into lethal expertise. The successful strikes demonstrated that Argentine air power remained capable of inflicting decisive damage when tactical conditions aligned, but fuel shortages and aircraft attrition meant such opportunities occurred rarely and at enormous cost. The psychological impact of Fitzroy resonated through both armies. Argentine pilots, escorted by Mirage fighters, flew decoy missions to draw Sea Harriers away from strike packages, their success measured in minutes of clear airspace rather than enemy aircraft destroyed. But fuel states forced bingo calls at 35 to 40 minutes, limiting combat air patrol effectiveness and leaving ground forces vulnerable to British helicopter assault and close air support. Medical facilities strained beyond capacity as combat casualties mixed with environmental injuries that increased nightly. Field dressings ran critically short, forcing medics to reuse elastic bandages after boiling, while morphine syrettes were logged by serial number and reserved for trauma cases that met strict triage criteria. Hypothermia affected entire platoons as wet uniforms lost insulating properties, and soldiers' core body temperatures dropped below sustainable levels. The cultural lifelines that sustained morale grew more precious as conditions deteriorated. Harmonica music echoed from sangars, where conscripts shared chipped playing cards and 9-volt radios that played Charlie Garcia cassettes during brief respites from artillery harassment. A single shared coripan could draw an entire platoon to one brazier, the smell of grilled meat temporarily overwhelming the constant odors of cordite, peat smoke, and diesel exhaust. Religious observance intensified as the final battle approached. Priests heard confessions in shell scrapes at midnight, while rosaries appeared on rifle slings, and some soldiers kissed medallions of San Cayetano before patrol duty. The chaplains held mass in windy tent chapels where canvas walls flapped constantly, and communion wine froze solid in chalices made from mess kit components. One A4 Skyhawk returned from a strike mission with a 1,000-pound bomb hung live on its pylons, the pilot landing gently, while ground crew slid underneath with wooden wedges to disarm the weapon by hand, a routine that had become commonplace, as ammunition shortages forced pilots to retain unexpended ordnance for future missions rather than jettisoning it over empty ocean. Mechanics painted fresh shark mouths on aircraft the night before missions, knowing that pilots might not return but maintaining the ritual anyway. The ground crews kept repainting the same designs on different airframes as combat losses mounted, their superstition becoming a form of memorial for men who disappeared into South Atlantic weather and British missile envelopes. Think about lying in those waterlogged trenches, night after night, listening to the rumble of approaching artillery, while your rifle mechanism freezes and your boots turn into blocks of ice that cut off circulation to toes already turning black from prolonged exposure. The British breakout from their beachhead positions had begun, their reconnaissance patrols probing the outer defensive ring with increasing boldness, while Scorpion and Scimitar reconnaissance tanks tested Argentine strongpoints with direct fire missions that announced the beginning of the final. Phase 3. Nights of close-quarters battle that would determine whether 9,000 conscripts could hold the ring of hills against overwhelming firepower and professional soldiers who had trained their entire careers for exact this kind of assault. The sentry's muzzle flash illuminated snowflakes like sparks across Mount Longdon's rocky summit on the night of June 11th, when Private Carlos Mendoza heard British whispers drifting through the darkness and squeezed his trigger, igniting 3 nights of close-quarters hell that would determine whether Argentina's conscripts could hold the ring of May-Day. Hills through bayonet charges and grenade duels fought in sleet that turned blood into ice crystals on granite ledges. These final battles reveal warfare stripped to its most primitive essence. How modern military technology ultimately gives way to rifle butts and fighting knives when soldiers close to arm's length in darkness, and why the mathematical advantages of artillery and air support mean nothing when victory depends on which teenager can reload faster in a frozen trench at 0200 hours. The British assault began with textbook precision across multiple axes. 3 Commando Brigade launched simultaneous attacks against Mount Harriet, Two Sisters, and Mount Longdon, while 5th Infantry Brigade prepared to strike Tumbledown and Wireless Ridge the following night. Each objective had been surveilled for weeks through sniper scopes and patrol reports that mapped Argentine defensive positions with the methodical thoroughness that characterized professional military operations. Company C of Argentina's 7th Infantry Regiment held Mount Longdon's western approaches, their sangars reinforced with turf blocks and corrugated metal that provided minimal protection against naval gunfire, but excellent concealment from British thermal imaging. Sergeant Eduardo Giacomelli had positioned his machine gun team behind a natural rock formation where interlocking fields of fire covered the most likely British approach routes. The attack developed through phases that compressed hours of planning into minutes of violent execution. British Royal Marines moved through the darkness with night vision equipment that revealed Argentine positions as heat signatures against the frozen landscape. Their assault rifles, equipped with image-intensifying sights that provided decisive advantages in close-range engagements, where muzzle flashes pinpointed targets for immediate suppression. Argentine defenders fought with obsolete equipment and desperate courage. Their FAL rifles lacked night vision capability, forcing soldiers to aim by sound and muzzle flash while British troops engaged targets they could see clearly through electronic optics. The technical disparity became apparent within minutes, as Argentine casualties mounted under precision fire from enemies who remained invisible in the darkness. But the terrain favoured close-quarters combat, where technology mattered less than individual determination. Mount Longdon's granite outcroppings channeled British advances into narrow defiles, where Argentine defenders could engage at point-blank range with rifles, grenades, and improvised weapons. Private Domingo Lumby held his position until British paratroopers closed to within 5 meters, then detonated a grenade that killed himself and 3 attackers in an explosion that showered rock fragments across both trenches. The fighting on Two Sisters developed into a series of isolated engagements as British forces infiltrated Argentine positions under cover of artillery fire that pulverized defensive strongpoints. 45mm mortars fired illumination rounds that turned the battlefield into a flickering hellscape of shadows and explosions, while soldiers fought hand-to-hand combat with entrenching tools and bayonets. When ammunition ran low, Mount Harriet fell after 6 hours of continuous assault, its Argentine defenders overwhelmed by coordinated attacks from multiple directions that exploited gaps in the defensive line. The survivors withdrew towards Stanley under covering fire from positions that had been pre-registered for defensive artillery missions, their retreat covered by machine gun teams that expended their remaining ammunition in sustained bursts, designed to buy time rather than inflict casualties. The second night brought attacks against Tumbledown and Wireless Ridge, where BIM-5 Marines, Argentina's elite naval infantry, fought with the professional competence that had characterized their training and deployment. These were not teenage conscripts, but career soldiers, whose expertise in small unit tactics allowed them to mount effective counterattacks despite overwhelming British advantages in firepower and technology. Major Carlos Carrizo Salvadores led BIM-5's defense of Tumbledown, with tactical skill that forced British guards to fight for every meter of ground. His Marines had prepared interlocking positions that maximized defensive fire while providing covered withdrawal routes if individual strongpoints became untenable. When British assault troops penetrated the outer perimeter, Carrizo Salvadores personally led counterattacks that reclaimed lost positions through close-quarters combat that left both sides exhausted and bleeding. The Marines fought with Malvinas, Carajo, echoing through wind that whipped sleet horizontally across granite ledges slippery with ice and blood. 9 Argentines and 10 British soldiers died on Tumbledown during fighting that continued through dawn, each position changing hands multiple times as small groups of men struggled for control of rock formations that provided commanding fields of fire over the approaches to Stanley. Wireless Ridge witnessed the collapse of Rim 7's defensive line under fire from Scorpion and Scimitar reconnaissance tanks, whose 76mm guns engaged Argentine positions with direct fire at ranges where individual soldiers could be targeted and eliminated systematically. The distinctive clatter of tank rounds ricocheting off rock announced the beginning of the final withdrawal, as conscripts abandoned positions they could no longer hold against armoured vehicles supported by artillery that had been registering targets for hours. Throughout these engagements, individual acts of courage occurred on both sides, as professional soldiers and teenage conscripts discovered reservoirs of determination they hadn't known they possessed. A priest carried a white flag between opposing lines to collect wounded, both armies holding fire for 10 minutes while he dragged casualties by their webbing toward aid stations that lacked adequate medical supplies to treat the trauma cases that streamed in throughout the night. British naval gunfire from frigates positioned in Berkeley Sound added another dimension of terror to the close-quarters fighting. 4.5-inch shells arrived without warning to transform defensive positions into flying clods of frozen peat, their explosions popping eardrums and collapsing sangars that had taken weeks to construct. Some trenches buried their occupants under wet turf that suffocated men too wounded to dig themselves free. The environmental conditions pushed human endurance beyond sustainable limits. Soldiers fought in temperatures below freezing while sleet turned blood into ice crystals that made weapons slippery and difficult to operate. Rifle mechanisms jammed with peat grit that accumulated despite constant cleaning, forcing men to clear stoppages manually while under fire from enemies who pressed attacks through conditions that tested the limits of what flesh and blood could endure. Medical evacuation became impossible during the height of the fighting, as artillery fire interdicted casualty collection points and helicopter landing zones. Wounded men lay in shell scrapes for hours while their injuries worsened, some freezing to death before stretcher bearers could reach them through defensive fires that continued throughout the night. Picture yourself crouched behind granite ledges while mortar fragments whine overhead and your rifle bolt freezes solid, knowing that the next British assault might overrun your position and leave you fighting with bayonet and entrenching tool against professional soldiers equipped with night vision optics. By dawn on June 13th, the outer defensive ring had cracked irreparably, its survivors streaming back towards Stanley, while British artillery observers adjusted fire onto withdrawal routes that offered no cover from shells that pursued fleeing conscripts across open ground toward the final positions that surrounded the capital, where 9,000 Argentine soldiers would make their last stand in basement shelters while glass rattled with every impact and children counted shell bursts to stay sane. Glass shards tinkled like wind chimes across Stanley's government house floor as another British shell impacted 200 meters away, while in the basement beneath, 9-year-old Maria Elena Felton counted the explosions 47, 48, her small voice barely audible above the rumble of naval gunfire that had turned Argentina's capital into a death trap, where civilians cooked on Primus stoves and soldiers prepared for their final battle. This siege reveals how modern warfare's industrial killing power reduces human beings to statistics, military and civilian alike, while the individual stories of courage and terror that unfold in basements and bunkers remind us that behind every strategic decision lie real people facing choices between survival and honor in circumstances no training could prepare them for. The British bombardment of Stanley began at dawn on June 10th with methodical precision that reflected weeks of target analysis and fire control planning. HMS Avenger, Glamorgan, and other frigates positioned themselves in Berkeley Sound, where their 4.5-inch guns could engage targets throughout the town with direct fire missions that systematically destroyed military installations, supply dumps, and anything that might support Argentine resistance. 1,300 civilians found themselves trapped between opposing forces as the ring of hills collapsed and surviving Argentine units streamed back toward the capital. Families crowded into basement shelters that had never been designed for prolonged occupation, their children learning to identify different types of incoming artillery by sound signature, the whistle of naval shells, the crump of mortar rounds, the distinctive shriek of multiple launch rocket systems that painted the sky with trails of fire and smoke. Brigadier General Mario Benjamin Menendez established his final command post in a reinforced bunker near the airfield, where he coordinated the defense of 9,800 soldiers whose morale had cracked under weeks of bombardment, supply shortages, and the psychological pressure of fighting a modern army with obsolete equipment. His staff officers worked by candlelight and kerosene lamps as the town's electrical system failed under repeated shelling. The Argentine defensive plan called for urban warfare that would bleed British assault forces white among Stanley's buildings and streets. Anti-tank teams positioned throughout the town carried obsolete, recoilless rifles and rocket-propelled grenades that might stop light armor, but couldn't penetrate the frontal armor of British main battle tanks. Machine gun nests occupied key intersections where interlocking fields of fire could channel enemy advances into killing zones. But the soldiers manning these positions were no longer the confident troops who had landed on April 2nd. Weeks of naval bombardment, air attack, and artillery harassment had reduced many units to hollow shells of their original strength. Conscripts huddled in waterlogged trenches where they'd watched their friends die from hypothermia, shrapnel wounds, and the constant stress of combat that had pushed teenage minds beyond their breaking point. Private Roberto Kurelev wrote his final letter home on June 13th, the paper damp with condensation from his breath in a bunker where temperature never rose above freezing. His handwriting deteriorated as his fingers grew numb, the words expressing love for family members he expected never to see again, and apologies for failures he couldn't articulate. The letter would be found weeks later in his pocket, after British burial teams processed Argentine casualties with the grim efficiency of modern warfare's administrative aftermath. The civilian population endured conditions that tested human resilience beyond rational limits. Families shared single rooms in basement shelters where Primus stoves provided the only heat and cooking facility, while artillery fragments punched holes through roof tiles that let in sleet and freezing wind. Children learned to sleep through explosions, while adults rationed food and water with mathematical precision that meant the difference between survival and starvation. Mrs. Dorothy Blake, a Kelper whose husband worked for the Falkland Islands Company, kept a diary throughout the siege that recorded the daily reality of life under bombardment. "Glass everywhere again today," she wrote on June 12th. "The children are getting used to it. They sweep up the pieces like it's a game." I don't know if that's good or terrifying. Her entries captured the surreal normalization of violence that occurs when extreme conditions persist long enough to become routine. Argentine medical facilities collapsed under the combined pressure of combat casualties and environmental injuries that had accumulated over weeks of exposure to conditions that exceeded human physiological limits. Field hospitals operated without adequate anesthesia, antibiotics, or surgical instruments, while doctors performed amputations and trauma surgery by flashlight in bunkers that flooded with every high tide. The supply situation reached catastrophic proportions as British naval gunfire interdicted the airfield and made C-130 operations impossible. The last successful resupply flight had occurred on June 8th, leaving frontline units with ammunition stocks measured in magazines per rifle and rations that consisted of cold soup heated over candle flames when fuel became unavailable for cooking fires. Morale indicators that Argentine officers monitored through daily reports painted a picture of institutional collapse. Desertion rates climbed as conscripts abandoned positions to seek shelter in town buildings, where civilian families shared their meager supplies with soldiers who looked more like refugees than military personnel. Some units maintained discipline through the leadership of non-commissioned officers, whose personal example sustained small groups of men who continued fighting because they couldn't conceive of alternative courses of action. The final British assault never materialized in the urban combat scenarios that Argentine planners had anticipated. Instead, the combination of naval gunfire, artillery harassment, and logistical strangulation achieved strategic objectives without requiring house-to-house fighting that would have cost hundreds of casualties on both sides. By June 13th, organized Argentine resistance had collapsed, except for isolated strongpoints whose defenders lacked communication with higher headquarters. Religious observance intensified during the final hours, as priests moved between positions to hear confessions and provide last rites for soldiers who expected to die, defending positions they couldn't abandon without violating oath and honor. Father Miguel Hussein celebrated Mass in a basement chapel, where communion wine had frozen solid and altar candles provided the only light for congregations that included both military personnel and civilians seeking spiritual comfort. The breaking point arrived when British artillery observers began calling fire missions onto civilian areas where Argentine soldiers had taken shelter. Menendez faced the impossible choice between continued resistance that would result in massive civilian casualties and surrender that would preserve lives but abandon the national mission that had brought his forces to the islands. His radio communications with Buenos Aires grew increasingly desperate as he requested permission to surrender, while mainland commanders demanded continued resistance regardless of cost. The white flag appeared at 1300 hours on June 14th, raised by a staff officer whose hands shook from cold and exhaustion as he carried the surrender terms through streets littered with glass, unexploded ordnance, and the debris of a 74-day campaign that had exceeded every participant's understanding of what human beings could endure. Consider the weight of that decision, ordering 9,000 soldiers to lay down their weapons and submit to captivity after months of combat that had claimed the lives of friends and comrades, whose sacrifice would now appear meaningless. To families who had trusted their government's promises of quick victory and national glory. The sound of silence that followed the ceasefire seemed louder than artillery to soldiers who had lived under bombardment for weeks, their ears ringing from explosions that had punctuated every hour of every day, until the absence of violence felt more unnatural than its presence, a psychological aftermath that would haunt survivors for decades as they struggled to find meaning in defeat that had transformed boys into men through experiences no training could replicate. The metallic taste of blood and cordite still lingered in Corporal Ricardo Perez's mouth as he laid down his FAL rifle on Stanley's windswept airfield, joining 11,000 Argentine prisoners, whose war had ended not with heroic last stands, but with the administrative efficiency of Red Cross processing teams, who would repatriate them within weeks to a homeland that had already begun, forgetting their sacrifice. This aftermath reveals how modern warfare's human cost extends far beyond casualty statistics, transforming young men through experiences that civilian society cannot comprehend or adequately address, while the strategic lessons of logistics versus valor reshape military thinking for generations of officers who must balance national ambition against the mathematical realities of distance, supply, and technological disparity. The surrender process unfolded with the bureaucratic precision that characterizes military operations even in defeat. British officers organized Argentine prisoners into processing groups, while Royal Marine Guards maintained security with professional courtesy that contrasted sharply with the propaganda images both sides had constructed during 74 days of combat. Many conscripts appeared more relieved than defeated, their hollow eyes and frostbitten extremities testament to environmental conditions that had tested human endurance beyond rational limits. Private Eduardo Santana shuffled through the prisoner queue with feet so swollen from trench foot that his boots had to be cut away by British medics who documented injuries with clinical detachment. His toenails had turned black weeks earlier. Sensation in his extremities reduced to constant burning pain that would persist for decades as a permanent reminder of nights spent in waterlogged foxholes where survival had depended on willpower alone. The repatriation flights began within days of the ceasefire. C-130 Hercules transports that had once carried supplies and reinforcements, now loaded with defeated soldiers whose silence spoke more eloquently than any debriefing report. Many clutched letters from home that they'd kept pressed against their chests throughout the campaign, the paper worn soft from repeated reading and stained with peat, blood, and tears shed in moments when officers weren't watching. Buenos Aires received its returning veterans with confusion that reflected the junta's rapidly crumbling authority. Plaza de Mayo crowds that had celebrated the April landing now turned against Galtieri's government, their chants of Malvinas, Si Guerra, No, expressing a popular sentiment that blamed military leadership rather than the young men who had fought with obsolete equipment against impossible odds. The contrast between official rhetoric and battlefield reality became undeniable as survivors shared their experiences with families and journalists. The post-war audits exposed systemic failures that had doomed Argentina's military effort from its inception. Procurement investigations revealed missing cold weather gear, mismatched ammunition lots, and tents that leaked at 10 to 12 stitch points per seam, bureaucratic failures that had sentenced conscripts to fight in summer weight jackets, while British forces deployed Arctic warfare equipment designed specifically for South Atlantic conditions. Lieutenant General Leopoldo Galtieri resigned on June 17th as political opposition demanded accountability for the military adventure that had cost 649 Argentine lives and accelerated the nation's return to democracy in 1983. The junta's collapse vindicated critics who had warned that military governments lacked the institutional competence to conduct complex operations, requiring coordination between Army, Navy, and Air Force elements operating at maximum range from their bases. The veterans' homecoming revealed gaps between official commemoration and personal trauma that would persist for decades. Many returned to silence and scarce benefits, their sacrifice acknowledged through ceremonial gestures that failed to address practical needs of men whose hearing had been damaged by artillery fire, whose limbs bore permanent frostbite injuries, and whose psychological wounds required treatment that Argentine medical facilities couldn't provide. Captain Alberto Filippi continued flying commercial aircraft for decades after the war, his cockpit skills honed through combat experience that had taught him to navigate by instinct when instruments failed under battle damage. But nightmares disrupted his sleep for years, as memory replayed moments when his perfectly delivered bombs had failed to explode due to maintenance errors that robbed Argentina of tactical victories that might have changed the war's outcome. The aircrew's sacrifice became a source of pride that transcended political debate about the war's strategic wisdom. Grupo Cinco's loss rates had reached 10 to 20% on some days, yet missions launched at dawn and dusk, regardless of casualties that decimated squadrons whose pilots flew obsolete aircraft against modern air defenses, with a determination that earned respect from enemies who shot them down. Mechanics had painted shark mouths on Skyhawks throughout the campaign, repainting the same designs on different airframes as combat losses mounted, their superstition becoming memorial for pilots who disappeared into South Atlantic weather and British missile envelopes. The ground crew's ritual reflected broader Argentine military culture that valued honor above survival, tradition above tactical innovation, courage above technological advantage. The strategic lessons proved more complex than simple defeat might suggest. Argentina's initial success in seizing the islands demonstrated that professional military planning could achieve tactical objectives against surprised opponents, but the campaign's ultimate failure revealed how initial advantages dissolve when logistics cannot sustain operations at extended range against enemies with superior resources and technology. The environmental factor had exceeded every participant's expectations. Peat bogs that swallowed men to the knee, gloves that stayed wet for days, oil-stained wool that smelled like sheep and diesel. The South Atlantic's physical reality had punished both sides while favoring defenders with superior equipment and supply lines that could maintain combat effectiveness through winter conditions that reduced human beings to their most basic survival instincts. Religious observance had sustained many veterans through experiences that civilian society struggled to comprehend. Rosaries on rifle slings, medals of San Cayetano kissed before patrol duty, what confessions heard in shell scrapes at midnight. These rituals had provided psychological anchors during combat that stripped away civilizational restraints and reduced existence to immediate questions of survival, duty, and meaning. The memory culture that emerged after 1983 transformed Los Pibes de Malvinas into national symbols, whose annual vigils on April 2nd included candles, name-reading, and cold night marches that honored sacrifice while questioning the political decisions that had made such sacrifice necessary. The veterans' testimony challenged official narratives on both sides, their accounts revealing complex truths about warfare that transcended simple categories of victory and defeat. Some former enemies later met during commemorative ceremonies that emphasized shared humanity over national differences. An Argentine and British veteran reportedly traded chocolate in no man's land during a ceasefire, each backing away without words, in an encounter that both men later described as meeting a ghost, their brief interaction acknowledging common humanity that war's artificiality had temporarily obscured. The island's sensory imprint remained vivid in veterans' testimony decades after the fighting ended. Peat smoke, sheep dung, cordite after barrages, and the metallic tang of blood in wind at 3 to 5 degrees Celsius. These memories persisted with immediacy that academic histories could not capture, their specificity preserving experiential truth that statistical analyses and strategic assessments necessarily omitted. Picture yourself returning to a society that had moved on while you spent 74 days learning that human beings can endure conditions that exceed every reasonable expectation of what flesh and blood can survive, and that courage alone cannot overcome the mathematical realities of modern warfare's industrial killing power. Air Force museums now display twisted aluminum fragments and scorched Exocet tail cones behind glass, where schoolchildren count rivets, while veterans tell stories that transform artifacts into testimony about young men who flew impossible missions because their nation's honor seemed to require such sacrifice, regardless of whether strategic wisdom justified the costs their courage would ultimately pay.